Thank you, Alex, for joining us.
Stephen, it's great to be here.
Is wokeism a religion?
Well, one of the biggest problems of the study of religion is that it's impossible to define. Really, it's so many games are played about terminology in this respect. Wokeism as a religion. Fine, define wokeism and define religion. It's impossible. I get what people mean when they say that. Sure, they mean something like it involves dogmatism and it involves a sort of unshakable system of ethics which may or may not be grounded in rationality. Sure, when somebody says that, they don't literally think that wokeism should belong in the categories of the great world religions like Christianity and Islam. That's not what they're saying. They're sort of just making a critical point. And no one ever says that like it's a good thing. You know what I mean? No one ever sort of says wokeism is a religion and they're complimenting it. It's supposed to be an insult, so.
Which is quite ironic because many of the people who say that are Christian conservatives.
Yeah.
And they use that, as you say, as a kind of derogatory term for wokeism. So
well, it's also because so many on the left are critical of religion as a broad category. A lot of them are just atheists. And so it's sort of a tu quoque. It's sort of like, well, you criticize us for having our dogmas and having our sacred things and our sacred cows and that we will not slaughter. But so do you. You're doing it as well. So it doesn't actually get you a leg up, so to speak. It just sort of puts people on equal footing. I think it's maybe quite a lazy attack because anything can be a religion. I had this sort of conversation / debate with Konstantin Kitten about this on his show recently, talking about wokeism, veganism as religions. I'm like, sure, but look at AI safety, for example. A lot of people are saying we really need to pay attention to AI and stop the development because otherwise the world's going to come to an end. You'd be like, well, that's a religion. It's an apocalyptic death cult that's screaming about Armageddon, saying that we need to adopt an entirely new ethical system, with wacky views about consciousness and about humans' relationship to technology and to robots. It's just like a bunch of religious zealots. Okay, you probably get the point that I'm making. I'm kind of criticizing it, but is someone in a theology department going to start taking that seriously as a religious discipline? No, of course not. But that's not what it's intended to do.
But you are someone who is very much an atheist YouTuber, talking about issues around Christianity as a religion, certainly criticizing Christianity and other religions. Shouldn't you be doing the same thing for wokeism if we define it, or at least having similar traits to religion, if you were being consistent?
Absolutely. Well, where I don't like to think that although maybe I used to say this, it's not so much that I criticize Christianity per se. There's lots in Christianity to love. There's really lots to like, and there's lots that I like, and there's lots to dislike. So the history of Christianity in practice, especially in terms of its dogmatism and its suppression of freedom of thought. The Catholic Church had its Librorum Prohibitorum, index, the index of prohibited books, that was publishing into the second half of the 20th century. And it included people like Descartes, and included people like, of course, Galileo and Copernicus, but Voltaire, and basically it's a great list of book recommendations. Okay, so that's not to love. But the thing I'm criticizing there is not so much religion; it's the suppression of freedom of thought. So if I see that that's happening in this so-called woke environment, then sure, I'll criticize that and call that out as I have done and tried to do. But I just take issues as they come. The term woke is very nebulous. The term religion is very nebulous. Christianity as a concept is quite nebulous. So we look at specific issues and see what we can do. But I understand why definitions have to exist. People need to put a label on something so we kind of know what we're talking about. And when you say somebody's woke, you'd find it difficult to define it, but you kind of know what they mean. My friend Stephen Woodford, who has a YouTube channel called Rationality Rules, has made this point on the sort of what is a woman question. He's like, well, what is a castle? Define a castle. And I promise you I can find an example of a castle that does not fit into that definition. When somebody says, what is a woman, they don't actually care about your definition. They're doing a litmus test to see what side of the issue you're on. You know what I mean? Because people say, you ask a politician, what is a woman? And they say, adult human female. And everyone goes, right, they're on my side. But what the hell does that mean? What does female mean? What does human mean? What does adult mean? Over 18? What are you talking about? All of those words are equally nebulous and impossible to define. because you're not interested in the definition of a woman. You're like, oh, are you sort of broadly pro or anti-trans stuff? And it's just a euphemism for that, you know what I mean? And so all of this definition stuff, wokeism's a religion, you know, what is a woman? It's all just a big old euphemism for like, are you on my side or not?
We're getting very Jordan Peterson. What is how? What is you? What is do?
I can understand why he does that, you know, but I think he maybe takes it a little bit too far, but yeah. It's a worthwhile pursuit.
Was it Chesterton who said, you know, if we're not going to believe in nothing, we're going to believe in anything? That's a very sort of butchered quote. But do you think that that's right? You know, when as religion declines, suddenly people will start believing in certain irrational ideas. You talk about what is a woman. Certainly, I think there's an argument to make that the rise of woke beliefs around trans people claiming that trans women are actually biological or are actually women is completely irrational and goes against scientific basis. So what do you think about this argument around sort of believing in anything as Christianity and other religions die?
People are predisposed to, well, when people talk about believing in something, of course everyone believes in literally something. I believe that this chair exists, for example, right? But people need some kind of ethical system or moral system to navigate the world, right? And I'm not talking about thinking murder is wrong or whatever, but sort of like values, like, you know, do you value your health? Do you get out of bed in the morning? Do you brush your hair? Do you value your aesthetics? Do you value the views that your fellow human has of you? And those aren't so much things that you decide, they're things that you discover, that you feel. Yeah, it turns out I actually do care about what society thinks of me, so I'm not going to sort of like be Diogenes. I mean, I could go up on stage where I was yesterday, and I could have like tried to make a point about meaninglessness by doing a Diogenes and just taking off my clothes and just start like masturbating on stage or something, right? Like, cool, that would have made a point, but turns out I just care about what other people think. And I could try to throw that off to make a philosophical point, like he did, but I kind of just can't. In a way, that's a moral, broadly speaking, that's a moral thing. It's something I care about. It's to do with value, right? So that's always going to be there. Religion, I don't think necessarily provides that per se. It just has traditionally captured what people care about. You know, people intuitively feel that there's a moral force. They intuitively, you know, like in the height of like Christian Europe, somebody might have seen two men kissing and been like just a bit grossed out by it. Oh, I don't like looking at that. And so, you know, this ethical system of Christianity that says that that's wrong sort of captures that. And so people are attracted to it for that reason. Of course, it does also go the other way. Like if you teach children at a young age that homosexuality is immoral or something, they're more likely to grow up thinking that. But it's sort of, it's a balance. You know, it creates this reflective equilibrium. So what I mean to say is that, like, yeah, of course, if you take away that structure, people are going to seek for like a new structure. And maybe they'll identify with like wokeism as a thing. But no one's actually doing that proactively. Wokeism isn't a label that people put on themselves, like Christians do. I'm a Christian, this is how I view the world. A so-called woke person isn't going to do that. They're not going to say I'm
Well,
woke.
originally they did.
Yeah, right. But now, I mean, you know, because like what do you mean when you say that somebody religion declines and now it's being replaced by something else? For the person who is themselves replacing that vision in their head, that ideology, like what is it that they're replacing it with? I mean, I don't know what they would say.
I suppose the question is really based around the idea of rationality. And there's this argument that as religion died out, as Christianity goes away, as we become more secular, automatically people become more rational, because atheism is far more rational and it's based on sort of empirical truth. But actually the truth is that as secularism has risen, people still believe, despite being atheists, in ideas which are completely irrational, in, you know, as we've just talked about. So what do you say to that argument?
Well, people are not rational. I think it's quite well known. I mean, Aristotle defines man as a rational animal, but I think it's better, you know, perhaps an irrational animal, as opposed to irrational, like a plant, which doesn't have reason at all. Like, yeah. But the thing is that this is part of the human condition. This isn't a product of wokeism, and it's not the cause of wokeism. I mean, I don't know, do you consider yourself conservative?
Sure.
What do you think about the monarchy?
I'm generally supportive.
Right, but I'm sure that if I really pressed you on the legitimacy of right to rule by like blood, like heritage, you would probably have to say that there's something immoral or irrational about that. Maybe say there are other reasons to support the monarchy. I don't want to put words in your mouth or anything, but a lot of the time, like, irrationality exists there too, and that's not something that should necessarily be criticized. I had a conversation with Rory Stewart recently, and he was talking about conservatism and how he celebrates contingency and says, like, there are certain things that you cannot rationalize. I can't rationalize, he said, he was talking about like planning reform in the UK, like building houses, and he says, well, why not just get rid of all of these planning regulations and just build more houses? Because doing so will disrupt the aesthetic of the nation. It will like ruin beautiful landscapes. Is that something that is like rational, that I can quantify? No. Like, Rory seemed to suggest that he was quite moved watching the coronation. This man, this fellow human being, goes behind a cloth because we're not worthy to see the Archbishop rubbing chrism oil on his chest and pretending as if that actually does anything. But he's quite moved by it, Can I explain that? Can I rationalize that? No. That's a conservative. Now, that has less of a societal impact, somebody liking the monarchy, you know what I mean? But it's just a common story on both sides, And it shouldn't be rationalized. Things like, beauty, things like poetry and music and art and all of this kind of stuff shouldn't be rationalized. And similarly, I think in many ways, it's thought that the feeling that you have about ethics and justice maybe shouldn't be rationalized either. Like, irrationality just exists everywhere. And people pride themselves on their rationality, but that's a relatively new phenomenon. It used to be that the virtuous thing to do was to suppress what you rationally think and respect the sacred. That was the virtuous thing to do. Now we've completely flipped it. The virtuous thing to do is take this thing which you think is sacred, which you have this sort of emotional, ineffable connection to, but suppress that because you've got your rational brain to listen to instead. But the fact that one of those should win out over the other is not obvious to me,
Is an atheist West a more moral West?
I don't think so. I don't know. I don't think I can say that certainly. I mean, there are good and bad atheists and there are good and bad Christians, like atheism. Some people say that atheism is in part responsible for the rise of Soviet Russia, for example. I mean, Marxism seems to require atheism, so sure. I don't know if that means that being an atheist causes that, but it certainly seems to require atheism.
Why do you think that is? Is that because of, belief in God would sort of get in the way of the belief in the system of government, or? I
think so. I mean, Marxism is a very materialistic ideology. It has very clear ideas about the nature of sort of power relations and how people should interact with each other and what they should do about authority and this kind of stuff, which I think runs anathema to the idea that there is some kind of transcendent unifying power that exists above all. That sort of goes against everything that I've just said. That's probably the case. But then at the same time, Stalin is trained in a missionary, as a missionary. He's trained in a seminary, and this grows out of a Orthodox Russian community. This is a point that Christopher Hitchens used to make very, very powerfully, that if you inherit this country of people who for years have been completely servile, believing that the leader of their country, the Tsar, is essentially a god, and suddenly the Tsar's gone, you'd be a fool not to take advantage of a deep well of credulity like that, is what he said. And that's what he thought Stalin did. Okay, so fine, maybe atheism permits that. But then, on the other hand, like I say, this grows out of an Orthodox Russian Christianity. And at the same time, obviously religion has been used for a great deal of evil as well. But I don't think that it's because of religion. I think that people have political ends, people like power, people want land, people want control, and whatever's popular amongst the people they want to exert control over, they will manipulate to that end. Adolf Hitler had Gott mit uns, God with us, inscribed on every single Nazi belt buckle. Did he believe in God? Who knows? A lot of people say that he did, that he was a Roman Catholic. Maybe that itself, that people still believe that, is just a testament to the success of Goebbels' propagandic efforts. I mean, Hitler does write in Mein Kampf, in standing guard against the Jew, I am doing the handiwork of the Lord. Doesn't sound very atheist. Then people say to me, but that's because, he was actually an atheist. He wouldn't have done this if he was really a Christian. And then I say, yeah, fine, fair enough. But then think for a second, why would he think that pretending to be a Christian would make it easier to install his, fascist utopia, right? Like that bears thinking on. So even if Hitler himself is an atheist, atheism causes so much evil, why is it that he thought that by manipulating religious terminology, it would be easier to commit great evils? Well, so I don't know. I mean,
certainly in Nazi Germany, there was, you can criticize so many religious people, the Concordat with the Catholic Church, the Protestants were some leading Nazi figures, but some of the very, very rare moments of resistance against Nazism came from religious people. Hans and Sophie Scholl being a great example of that. I forget the name, was it Bishop Munster, who was one of the, I think he was the only kind of, I think he was a Protestant bishop, but he stood up and said, look, we shouldn't be doing this euthanasia against disabled people and so on. And he made this speech, and famously Hitler had to reverse his policy, if only temporarily. So it's quite interesting that it was actually those groups who seem to have done the most in terms of resisting. And maybe the communists, the sort of atheist communists, were the ones to begin with collaborating with the Nazis in 1939. So you can look at the coin from different perspectives.
That's exactly what I mean, is that like people just use religion to whatever end they need to use it for, right? If you're famously during the sort of abolition movement in America, people were not just using the same Bible to justify slavery and anti-slavery, but using the same verses. You can just sort of use it to your own ends. So
does that make it meaningless then?
It doesn't make it meaningless. It just means that like it's a tool that people, like when people try to use religious ideas to justify something precise, you should be careful. Do you know that Goebbels didn't let atheists into the SS?
I didn't know that.
I
know Goebbels is a massive atheist himself. He hated God and he hated religion.
Atheists were not allowed into the SS. That's quite strange. I don't know. Like there's lots of really interesting back and forth that you can have on this. But like I'm not trying to win a battle of being religious makes you evil and being an atheist makes you not. Of course, that's not the case. I think that people are evil and depraved. Some people are nice and kind and good, and that whichever one of those you are, if you want to legitimize what you're doing, you can just appeal to Scripture. That's what you can do.
But morality isn't random, is it? It comes from somewhere. There must be some framework. You say people pick and choose from the Bible, but generally the morality that is accepted across the West is pretty universal. It's not like some of us agree that killing people is wrong and some of us think it's right and some think raping is great and some, you know what I mean? So there is a basic moral framework that we all live by, which is entrenched surely in Christian values.
Well, you'd be surprised. I just did a podcast a couple of weeks ago with a Christian philosopher, William Lane Craig, who was justifying the slaughter of the Canaanites in the Old Testament. Now, God commands the Israelites to slaughter the Canaanites, the men, the women, and the children, and in fact the animals as well. And they're later punished for not fully completing the killing of the animals because they didn't think it was worthwhile. Now, I said to him, how can this be justified? How can this be justified? And he says, well, look, it is possible with an omnipotent God that things that outside of his explicit, condonement would be immoral can sort of become morally permissible. Okay, so, 5 minutes ago you're telling me that the fact that I have a moral intuition points to the existence of God because the force of that moral intuition is an argument, the moral argument for the existence of God. But now you're telling me that I have to suppress my intuition that killing children, and all of them, is wrong. If you talk about sort of this idea that people don't think that we should just go and kill people, and that must come from Christianity. Maybe from the New Testament, sure. But if you read the Old Testament, that can't be the case. It can't be intrinsically wrong if you're a Christian who believes in the Old Testament. It cannot be intrinsically wrong to murder innocent children or to kill innocent children. You can't believe that because God commanded that. And so maybe there's a way to make that work. Maybe you could say that, you literally need God's explicit permission and then it becomes moral. Fine. But I don't just intuitively think that killing innocent children is wrong unless God says so. I just think it's not a good thing to do anyway. So that ethical code can't come from Christianity as a whole, at least. And if you're talking about, I mean, the example you choose of sort of not killing people, had people not worked that out? I mean, like, it seems to me that when you imagine like the 10 Commandments, there are different versions of the 10 Commandments, but thou shalt not kill is a pretty famous one. It sort of reads to me a little bit like when you get together, when you found a nation and you need to like start writing laws for a new nation. You're going to write things like, okay, don't kill people, don't steal, that kind of, not because like people don't realize that, but because it's important. If you're setting out a moral, you've got to cover the basics.
You live in the
right?
West. You've grown up in Britain. Mm-hmm. You've grown up throughout this with this whole tradition, this massive history behind you, this entire culture that, you know, it seems obvious to us what you're saying. If you make this new nation, of course, you won't kill. But if you look at societies across the world, hunter-gatherer societies, if you go to Brazil, that's not necessarily obvious, or even in the Arab world, you know, where they stone people to death and so on. So I don't think it's necessarily just an obvious thing that's universal across all humanity and all societies and all cultures.
There are a few things to say. First is that the idea of like capital punishment, for example, even by quite horrendous methods, existed in Christian Europe for a very long time. It's quite recent, and there are indeed people today who think that, you know, you should be able to kill people for crimes like that, and
I suppose it's the difference between
maybe they're not
murder
stoning
and
them to
killing.
death, but that's the other thing, is that like the thing that's prohibited in the Old Testament is obviously not killing, because God then commands the Israelites to go and slaughter the Canaanites or to slaughter the Midianites and kill all of the men and the women who've slept with a man, but keep for yourselves all the women who have not slept with a man. God literally only knows what for. Can't be killing, has to be murder. So the thing that's not permitted here is murder. And what is murder? Like, okay, legally, like illegal killing, but morally, like, I guess, immorally killing someone in a way that's not just. Now, go to a hunter-gatherer society, you know, and watch them stone to death the dissident who's said something that they don't like, or you know, engage in some sexual promiscuity or something, right? Okay. But watch what happens if one of those, even in a hunter-gatherer society, watch what happens if somebody just tries to randomly murder somebody, tries to randomly kill them. I think they'd probably get turned on. And this is like a primitive version of the difference between murder and killing, right? Like, it might not be obvious okay, you mentioned like stoning in the Middle East, for example. Like, sure, yeah, like that's we consider that quite barbarous, you know. Oh, but we have this Christian ethic: thou shalt not kill. Well, no, we don't. We say thou shalt not murder. And if you go to that stoning and someone picked up a stone and threw it at somebody who was watching, who hadn't committed a crime, they'd get arrested. They'd get arrested and might even get stoned themselves. You know what I mean? So even there, the intuition that murder is wrong, that is unjustified killing, is wrong. Yeah, terrible. We can't stand for that. That exists in hunter-gatherer societies. That exists in the Middle East. That exists in Christian Europe.
The difference between what they define as murder in the Middle East or in some societies or whatever is, you know, honor killing would be an example of a distinction between, you know, Christian ethics and ethics in those kind of.
So then the Christian essence is not like the fact that you don't kill, but that you don't kill for this very specific reason.
Exactly,
right?
Yeah.
And sure, but like, I don't know if it's strictly Christian to say, I don't like honor killings. I mean, I don't know. I don't remember Jesus ever talking about it, you know. Like, maybe, like, it just becomes a bit more tenuous to me, the link. And like I say, there's a lot in Christianity to like. There's a lot of great moral teaching. There's a lot of wise, you know, there's a wise philosophical tradition that sort of stems from the teachings of Jesus. Sure, cool. But him amongst many other ancient philosophers too. And I don't know, this idea that the West is specifically Christian might be true in one sense, in that it's always identified with the Western, with the Christian religion, but it's probably done things which aren't very Christ-like. So if by Christian you mean nominally Christian and referring to the Bible sometimes tenuously to justify the morals and behaviors, fine. If you mean acting as Jesus would have done, I kind of just can't see the link, you know?
I suppose perhaps you've got to separate the scripture from the culture or the kind of history of Christianity.
Yeah.
And I certainly, you know, I think you're right, there's massive kind of discrepancies between how people interpret the Bible, what's written in the Bible, and what happens in reality. I do want to ask a bit about Soviet Russia. You mentioned kind of atheist society there. Is that an example of perhaps where atheism can lead to immoral outcomes, to say the least? I mean, tens of millions of people died under Stalinist Russia and under terrible circumstances. So do you separate the atheism from the communist system, or do you think they're sort of intrinsically linked?
As I said before, I think that certainly most forms of communism probably require atheism.
Yeah.
It's not to say that atheism leads to communism, but it is to say that most communists you meet are probably going to be atheists. Although, arguably some people like to talk about like Christian communism. They look at the history of the early church as portrayed in like the Acts of the Apostles as a sort of communist style. I don't know, I think that's a bit tenuous, right? But sure, like, yeah, I mean, atheism can happily permit something like Stalinist Russia. I would say that when it comes to like religious violence, not only is it permitted, but also encouraged by the religious tenet. Like it's referred to, like the religious foundation is referred to as justification for killing people, right? It's not just that it's permitted, it's that it's justified on those grounds. Atheism can at best permit great evil. It's never going to justify it because atheism doesn't have any content. Atheism is just a vacuum into which something like Stalinism can appear. So sure.
Is that a concern of yours in terms of atheism creating that vacuum where we get something even more dangerous than Christianity, for example, or other religions, and the negative consequences of those belief structures?
Certainly, because I mean, Christianity today is quite mild and quite. It's difficult to say that. That might partly just be due to the fact that it's lost a lot of its institutional power. Maybe we shouldn't forget how it acted when it did have power, because now it comes to us sort of like meek and mild, all sort of forgiving and humble. That's because it's sort of dying out and it's looking for a way back in. Maybe if everybody got attracted to that and the UK became super Christian again, then suddenly you'd start seeing a bit more of the nasty side of Christianity. That's also possible. But yeah, I mean, like, do I want to live in an atheist society? Like, no, I kind of want to live in a secular society. This is the other thing to say about... Well, actually, I don't know. Maybe I want to live in a Christian society. I wouldn't mind. That depends what kind of Christian society it is. I mean, a secular society is a bit of a vacuum. It means that there's no sort of unifying religious idea in government, for example. The thing is, if you have an officially religious government, it's very difficult to take it seriously. It doesn't feel very organic. It doesn't feel very believed in. It's just like the state religion. I mean, the UK is officially Christian, but like, what the hell does that even mean anymore? But like, secularism is a different thing from atheism as well. Like, Soviet Russia is atheist, but it's not secular. I mean, the Soviets are murdering priests. They're killing people for being religious. Secularism, when it comes to like, most atheists you speak to who are like sort of pro-atheists, they like the atheism thing, they think we should talk about that. They'll talk about secularism when it comes to government because of precisely something like this. Secular means not concerned or not having a hand in religious affairs. Murdering priests is having a hand in religious affairs. So it's something that an atheist can think is cool or think is not, but a secularist wouldn't be able to stand for. So if your goal is a Christian society, then there are certain things you're going to have to probably condemn. If you want an atheist society, it's going to be difficult to know how to manage that. Like, what, you're not going to allow like a religious person to be head of state? Like, what does that mean, an atheist society? How do you mandate that? How do you regulate it? If you mean a secular society, it means that nobody gets special treatment and nobody gets persecuted on the basis of religious belief alone. Sometimes the content of a religious belief can be worth, condemning or persecuting people for, but just the religious belief alone isn't enough. That's what secularism says. So you go to Soviet Russia as a secularist and you're the first person protesting against it.
You talked about abolitionism earlier of slavery, and I'm interested in why you think that movement came about if it wasn't to do with Christian values, Christian ethics. And I know that, as you said, on both sides they kind of quoted Christianity, but certainly it seems to be, from my understanding, a completely unique, novel moment when Britain and other Western European countries banned slavery compared to almost all other societies in world history which practiced that evil experience.
There are a few things to say. First is that slavery in the ancient world wasn't always as as terrible as like antebellum slavery in the United States. The kind of slavery that is characterized by the transatlantic slave trade is a particularly grotesque, unimaginable form of slavery, right? If you look at biblical slavery, for example, which I talk about a lot, one of the great lines of defense from an Old Testament defender or a Hebrew Bible defender is that what you're really talking about is something like indentured servitude. You know, like, especially in a time when if you weren't living under your master's roof and working for him, essentially without pay, well, you're getting paid because you're living in the house, right? If you didn't have that, you'd be out on the street, you'd be completely and utterly hopeless. People say that, okay, that is a totally different thing to the transatlantic slave trade. Like, it's difficult to seriously understand what's going on and like just be okay with it. So I think even like before, like even in the founding of America, you know, the founding fathers were riddled with the issue of slavery, and even then it takes like, you know, another sort of, or more than 50 years to finally seriously address the problem. Like, people knew that there was something sort of up with this, and I don't think that's a Christian thing. You say it's a novel moment, it also coincides with the first time in human history where we start to develop societies where we can kind of get by without it. I mean, one of the reasons that slavery is so prominent, especially in the ancient world until today in many areas of the world, is because people can't do without it, you know? Like, we didn't have like automation, we didn't have machines, we did like, just to run a normal household would have been difficult enough. But now, you know, we've got all sorts of stuff. We've got washing machines. We've got like computers that can do our building for us. You know, like.
But which other society at the time were questioning slavery in the same way as Western Christian societies?
I'm not
it
sure
wasn't happening in the Arab world, was it?
No, I'm not sure they were. But then I also, to be honest with you, I don't know, and I also don't know the details of what those slave trades were like. I imagine they were also.
Well, we know the Arab slave trade was
brutal.
terrible.
Yeah, I don't know, but. And I'm also, to be clear, I'm sort of agnostic on this question. If it is specifically because of Christianity, then awesome, great. Like, that would be good to know. I just don't see the evidence for that. For example, like if Christianity weren't in the picture, and the same thing happened, you know, like Europe is the first and only continent to start thinking about abolitionism, and then maybe America. And the question might arise, well, why is that? And someone might say, well, it has to be due to liberalism. Has to be because of like the inklings of the Enlightenment. I mean, why not the Enlightenment? Right? Think about it for a second. Like, Christianity is born 2,000 years ago. If Christianity is so obviously anti-slavery that it is the reason that people finally start becoming abolitionists, why does it take over 1,000 years for them to work that out? And then right at the moment of the Enlightenment, when the scientific method starts coming off the ground, and when people start criticizing religion and getting rid of the sacredness of religion, suddenly it's like, oh, maybe we should abolish slavery. But it's got nothing to do with the Enlightenment. It's got nothing to do with liberalism. No, it's to do with this Christianity that's been sitting dormant for over 1,000 years, and for some reason now has just been like.
Well, some people might say it was the Reformation, but
that could be true too. Sure, but like, I mean, like, like, are we sure about that? Like, with the theological reformation that happened in the Reformation, like, well, how much of that is going to be relevant to the question of slavery? I mean, why would it be?
I suppose it's the broader questioning of previous orthodoxies, and
Sure.
And you could argue that's, you know, tied in with the Enlightenment and so on. And
it's like the defining characteristic of the Enlightenment, you know, reason over authority, essentially. And so, and the Enlightenment isn't something that's not like a switch that flicks suddenly. It's like, you got a bunch of people who are Christians, and then Enlightenment values start influencing them. They're not going to just suddenly not be Christians. They're going to be a different kind of Christian. So it might still be Christians that are on this sort of side of the fence. And again, I'm not saying that slavery is abolished because of the Enlightenment. I'm just saying that there are different competing theses. And when you look at the fact that, put it this way, go back to antebellum slavery in the United States, hop in a time machine, get onto a plantation, meet the master of the house, look over at the slaves and say, you know what? I think that what you're doing there is unethical. I don't think that that's right. I don't think that God would like it. Where is the first place that person would turn, and plausibly so, in order to defend it? As I've said before, it sort of goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway. They'll turn to the Old Testament. They'll turn to the Hebrew Bible. And they'll say, like, literally, what are you talking about? What do you mean God doesn't like this? I cannot recognize what you mean. And then you say, well, what about, like, Jesus sort of valuing the individual? And they'd be like, yeah, but, like, look at this direct passage, you know? Like, St. Paul says, like, slaves be obedient to your masters, not just the good ones, but also the cruel, or the froward, as the King James Version has it. Like, you could so easily do that, and that's what they would do. And so, is Christianity got something to do with the abolition of slavery? Like, maybe, but maybe it's got more to do with the Enlightenment. I don't know. It seems a mystery that it took so long.
Let's talk about Islam. Now, in the UK recently, elections have been dominated by foreign wars in the Middle East. I think partly due to high Muslim populations in certain parts of Britain, and particularly in a recent by-election in Rochdale, that was the issue that dominated the by-election, and George Galloway won because he was talking about Gaza. Is it a concern for Britain and for you that suddenly Islamism has become far more dominant in UK politics than in the last 10, 20 years, as we've imported so many people from the Middle East, Pakistan and other places?
Yeah, well, sure. And I think most people would say that, or would maybe think that. I mean, Islam makes sacred a number of things which traditional, like British values, are anathema to. You know, freedom of speech, blasphemy laws, for example. It just can't. It can't be satisfied, and that's why you see this strange friction between people who liberally mindedly want to sort of respect a religious minority, that is Muslims in the United Kingdom, but at the same time want to be pro-free speech when, you know, somebody gets threatened for showing a picture of the Prophet Muhammad. They've got their hands tied a little bit. They don't really know what to do, and these frictions are inevitably going to arise in a multicultural society. These are just like defining characteristics of a multicultural society, and like, unless there are some forms of disagreement about aesthetics, values, culture, unless there's some actual disagreement that cannot be reconciled, you just don't have multiculturalism anymore. You would just have a sort of singular culture with like different ideas and different shades. To call it multiculturalism, you know, parallel existing cultures, you need to say that there are things that they actually disagree about.
So is multiculturalism fundamentally flawed?
I mean, we're sort of seeing the experiment play out, and I don't think it's going very well. You know, like, I mean, I don't know about fundamentally flawed, because to say it's fundamentally flawed means that every single time you run the experiment, it would fail. But I mean, it seems like people are very rapidly losing faith in it. It does seem a bit. I mean, I think people also have forgotten how experimental and how recent it is. For example, like you end up with these slogans that are said, diversity is our strength, this kind of stuff. I mean, you land at Heathrow Airport and you might see it on a poster on the wall, and you think like, well, I wonder why I have to be reminded of that so much if it's so true. And I also think about the fact that every society for the history of mankind has not just thought that it's a good idea, but like absolutely necessary for the survival of a nation and a community to be unified. Unity is our strength. You know, come together with a common aim, a common goal, sometimes against a common enemy, and like that's what brings us together. And it's like, no, like, despite that being a trivial truth for the history of humanity, now like Sadiq Khan has worked it out, and actually they were all wrong. And the thing that we should be actually doing is encouraging people to live parallel lives, eating different foods, speaking different religions, attending different religious worship sessions. Like, I don't know, I don't buy it. I don't think that's a good idea. But as I say, you know, we're seeing the experiment play out before our very eyes.
Well, diversity certainly wasn't the strength of the Habsburg Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. I mean, you know, there are some really serious issues. I mean, recently in terms of Islamism in the UK, obviously Sir David Amos was brutally murdered by an Islamist.
Yeah, which kind of just got forgotten about.
Right, and this is something I find fascinating. This seems to be completely forgotten out of our political memory.
And who was the chap that stepped down recently, a couple of months ago, an MP who stepped down because of the threats?
Oh, I know exactly. The guy who was an MP for Finchley, a Tory MP, who was concerned about threats to his safety.
And you know, this is something I spoke to Rory Stewart about. When Lindsay Hoyle breaks parliamentary procedure, that seemingly had something to do with the fact that they were worried that if they voted on the motion, as it were, MP safety would be put at risk. And
look what happened in Batley. The teacher in Batley.
Yep.
Who was basically hounded out of public
still
life.
in hiding.
And I think it's absolutely terrifying that he has had such little support from, let's say, Labour politicians, for example, and even, frankly, Conservatives who are scared to talk about this issue. Do you think that we need to be more muscular in terms of saying not all cultures, societies, religions are morally and culturally equivalent, moral relativism and so on. And actually, our values are better, Western culture is superior to, frankly, the cultures that you've come from, and you need to adapt to our ways of living and our ways of being tolerant and so on, and ditch your old values and things like that.
Depends what you want. Depends what kind of society you want to live in. Like I say, experiment is playing out and see how you like it. I mean, like a lot of people ostensibly at least claim that they enjoy the diversity of a place like London, for example. They enjoy the abundance of different foods, and they enjoy hearing different languages and all of this kind of stuff. If that's what you want, then cool. If it's not, if you prefer a more unified society, then yes. I don't know about like saying that, you know, this culture is better, but just saying that like it's different. Because this is the thing.
So you don't think our culture is better than, say, the culture in Pakistan?
Well, this is where it gets a bit complicated, because I think it's better in the sense that I prefer it, right? Like, but this is the essence of moral relativism, and that there are sort of two forms of moral relativism that you can have here. You can have the kind of moral relativism that says, well, I can't say something's better than another, so let's just sort of put it all together. And there's another that says, well, like, I don't believe in objective ethics, right? I just have my preferences, right? On a philosophical level, I'm not a moral realist, and so there are things I prefer. I prefer living in a society with a particular kind of political system, with freedom of speech, all that kind of stuff, and just aesthetically, you know, I prefer certain kinds of architecture and kinds of music and that kind of stuff, right? Can I say that architecture and that music and the food and all that kind of stuff is like better? Like, no, I'm not a moral realist. I don't think that exists. So I'm kind of a relativist. But I can say that because I prefer it, and because a lot of people might prefer it, they have a right, if they want to like vote for this kind of system, to sort of protect that aesthetic preference. And so in other words, like, it doesn't actually have to be that strong. You can you make the weaker point that this is just how I prefer it. You know what I mean? Like, a lot of people complain about modern architecture, and you could say, well, like, I can't prove to you that a building is beautiful or ugly. It's impossible. I can't tell you what to find beautiful or ugly, but what I can tell you is that if everybody living in a city just happens to prefer this particular kind of architecture, then it's perfectly rational to say that, you know, we shouldn't build this other form of architecture. So when it comes to like cultural clashing, I think it's enough to just say that you prefer to live in a particular kind of system, and you have the right to realize that and to vote for that. But yeah, I mean, if people want to claim to be principled on things like free speech and that kind of stuff, then of course they've got to be more muscular when something directly threatens it.
What do you make of the recent rise of anti-Semitism since October 7th across the West? I think we've seen, unfortunately, many students shout anti-Semitic slogans, and radical Islamists doing the same thing. You know, many Jews are concerned about what's going on, particularly in places like London, where you see these mass marches. Some people call them hate marches. What do you make of this issue, and how do we deal with it?
I think that anytime there's a conflict that involves identity, in this case religious or ethno-religious identity, people are going to get excitable, and like abuse and malice are going to increase. It's inevitable. I mean, for every person complaining about the rise of anti-Semitism, which is a very serious and uninspiring reality, there's also people complaining about the rise of anti-Muslim bigotry, which I'm sure is actually rising at the moment, right? I mean, there's also the problem of Islamism rising, as you say. That's what muddies the water. Like, obviously, like, yeah, it's bad. I don't know what more there is to say about it. Perhaps it's like an inevitability of identity-based conflicts, which aren't just as simple as nation after nation, right? It's not as simple as that. There's a lot more going on. There's a lot more in terms of religious undertones, especially because this is happening in the Holy Land. It just seems inevitable that's going to happen, and it's bad.
And finally, let's talk about meaning. I know you did a panel about this yesterday at this conference that we're speaking at. How do you think people, particularly young people who feel kind of meaningless in their lives or purposelessness in their lives, people like Jordan Peterson saying, look, this is a kind of way out of that. What would you say to those people, and you know, how can atheism, secularism give people meaning and purpose in their lives?
I don't think atheism and secularism provide meaning. As I say, that they are content neutral. They don't have anything to put forward. That's one of the big criticisms of new atheism that people make, is that they sort of tore down traditional value structures and put nothing in their place. I mean, people tried it with like humanism. I think the late Daniel Dennett was in favor of renaming new atheists to brights. It was sort of attempts like this which just sort of don't make very much sense to me. So like atheism isn't going to give you meaning. But then for a lot of people, you know, religion doesn't exactly do that too, you know. I think the reason religion works for most people in terms of meaning is because I was talking yesterday about the idea that whether meaning actually exists or not, there are times when you feel you have it and times you feel that you don't. And I have a feeling that meaning consists in having a goal to fulfill that you haven't fulfilled yet and feeling that it's worthwhile fulfilling that for some reason or other. And so religion is the perfect object for this, because it is constantly something which you don't have yet, which you think can be achieved, that is like afterlife, communion with God, and that you think once you've achieved it, it will be good. That, I think, is a recipe for meaning, right?
So how do you find meaning in your life without that?
Probably by seeking discomfort. The meaningful life consists in, I mean, the reason why so much self-help stuff is focused around having a cold shower and getting in the gym and eating healthily and, you know, not wanking and all of this kind of stuff, is because people didn't used to have the same crisis of meaning and the same feelings of nihilism when they wake up in the morning and they don't know if they're going to have food to eat and food to give their children or shelter over their heads. They literally didn't know if that was going to be there by the end of the night. And so immediately you've got a task to fulfill. That's your job for the day. And you don't sit and reflect, oh, but what's the ultimate like, no, it's ridiculous. I mean, actually, Jordan Peterson spoke about this once. He said, like, he was talking about how, oh, you know, the sun's going to expand and eat the earth in 5 billion years, so it's all pointless. And he says, so, you know, suppose you've got a child, and you say, well, why should I bother feeding my child if in 5 billion years the sun's going to expand and eat the earth? And the audience sort of chuckled. And he said, the fact that you're laughing, there's wisdom in that laughter. It's because that demonstrates that you just know that that's ludicrous, that that's not a good enough reason not to do that. There's something about having that task, like staring you in the face, where that question doesn't even arise. It literally wouldn't come up in your mind. If you don't have a kid and you don't have a kid to feed, then maybe you'd sit around and think, why should I do anything? You know, the sun's going to expand. But if you've got a child who's hungry, who you care about, that question doesn't even come up in your mind. So maybe it's a cop-out because you basically just like get rid of the question. But by putting yourself in a situation that's going to require that kind of immediacy, that kind of daily, I don't know if I'm going to fulfill this task, I think that's probably where meaning resides. So the problem that people are having at the moment, I think, yesterday I talked about Blaise Pascal, who in his Pensées has this excellent little passage on boredom. And he says that all of man's problems stem from his inability to sit quietly in a room, because people get bored. And he says, imagine somebody who passes through boredom by gambling. He places a stake every single day and tries to win some money. And that's how he lives his life. Offer him, says Pascal, all of the money that he could win from the game on the condition that he can't play the game. And you'd make him unhappy. Right? So obviously he doesn't actually care about the winnings, he cares about the game. Okay, then Pascal says, give him the game, let him play the game, but on the condition that he's definitely not going to win the money. You'd also make him pretty unhappy, right? What this person needs is not knowing if they're going to win, like winning being in the future, and also thinking that once they get that winning, they're going to be happy. None of which individually actually seem to be true, right? Because you know that if you just get given the money, you're still going to be pretty unhappy. You know, you don't just find meaning in the task. It's got something to do with the task being present and the reward being in the future, and the belief that that reward is going to be a good thing. That's why self-help type stuff says, go and have a cold shower. You know, even though there's no predator running after you, get on a treadmill and run anyway. You know what I mean? Because what this is playing the game without the winning. It's like, well, just play the gambling game, even though you're not going to win. You're not actually going to escape the predator. That doesn't exist. But just do it for the sake of the game. And people try that out, and it does something for them because it gets something right. Yeah, I feel better for having exercise, but there's still something missing and something that's not quite there. You need both. And maybe that's got something to do with having children, for example. Maybe like having children is a way to instantly just like fill your life with meaning because you've got that task all of a sudden. Not everybody wants to have children. I don't have children. I don't know if that's the case. But there's one example of how to put meaning in your life. The thing is, on a philosophical level, we have to be kind of pessimistic and recognize that what we're essentially doing is just pushing the question off. We're giving ourselves such tasks that are so impossible to ignore that we literally can't even think about the question. So that's kind of a cop-out. It's a bit of a bad answer probably, but it's basically all I can come up with. But also, look, I'm a 25-year-old like guy, like, you know, as if I'm going to like solve the crisis of meaning or something. It's ridiculous that they put me on a panel. And the fact that people showed up, knowing that I'm obviously not going to do that, means that people were interested in something slightly different. Yeah, I mean, I don't know where you're going to find meaning, but I know where you're not going to find it. And you're not going to find it sort of sitting around thinking about it. You know, that's it. You're not going to find it from your armchair, I think.
Go and have a cold shower. Thank you, Alex.
Of course.
Appreciate your time.